Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me, as always, is Laura.
I am genuinely thrilled we're tackling this one today, Rick, because in my view, this might be the single most consequential legal story the AI industry has faced since the whole generative boom kicked off a few years ago.
You're talking about the Anthropic copyright settlement, and I want to open with the headline number because when I first read it, I honestly had to go back and read it a second time just to convince myself it was real.
$1.5 billion. That is the figure. A federal court in Northern California just granted final approval to this past week, and it now stands as the largest copyright settlement in the entire history of the United States.
Let me make sure our listeners really feel the scale there, because $1 billion is one of those numbers that quietly stops meaning anything once you've said it out loud a handful of times in a row.
Right, so let's break it down per book, and it suddenly becomes very concrete. The settlement covers almost 500,000 pirated works, and the authors are receiving roughly $3,000 for each and every one of those titles.
And these are not abstract corporate plaintiffs that we're describing here. We're talking about individual novelists and nonfiction writers, many of whom have never once seen a check anywhere close to $3,000 from a single one of their books.
Exactly. And the claim rate tells you just how much this mattered to those writers. The Authors Guild reported that more than 91% of the covered books were actively claimed by their authors or their publishers, which is an extraordinary participation figure.
So walk me back to the very beginning, because this settlement clearly did not materialize out of thin air. The underlying lawsuit has been grinding its way through the court system for a couple of years now, hasn't it?
It certainly has. The case is called Bartz versus Anthropic, named for the author Andrea Bartz, and a class of writers first filed it back in 2024, alleging that their copyrighted books had been used to train Claude without any permission.
And here's the part that I find genuinely fascinating from a legal standpoint, because the judge in this case did not simply side with the authors straight across the board the way a casual observer might have naturally expected.
No, and this is exactly the nuance that almost everyone glosses over. Judge William Alsup ruled back in June of 2025 that training a model on lawfully acquired books was, in his own striking words, exceedingly transformative and therefore fair use.
So the act of training itself was ruled to be fair use. That is actually a real win for Anthropic and arguably for the whole industry, which makes that $1.5 billion bill even more puzzling to explain to people.
And that tension is truly the crux of the entire story. The training was fair use, but the way Anthropic obtained the books was absolutely not. The company downloaded and stored more than 7 million pirated books inside what the court called a central library.
So, the sin here was not the learning, it was the piracy itself. And they could have purchased or properly licensed those books through legitimate channels, but instead they pulled them straight from shadow libraries, and that single distinction ended up costing them everything.
Precisely that. The pirated works were drawn from datasets known as LibGen and PyLimi, which are essentially the internet's enormous, unauthorized book repositories. And courts have consistently shown they do not look kindly on wholesale downloading from those kinds of sources.
Let me push a little on the settlement terms themselves, because I think the fine print here matters enormously for how every other AI company is going to read this outcome and then quietly adjust their own behavior going forward from here.
The terms are actually a fair bit narrower than the giant headline suggests. The settlement covers past use only. It explicitly does not touch the model's outputs. And critically, it requires Anthropic to destroy that entire pirated dataset it had assembled.
That destruction clause is really interesting to me, because it means the remedy is not purely financial in nature. There's an almost physical dimension to it, forcing the company to actually delete the tainted material out of its own systems entirely.
And it sends the unmistakable message that money alone will not simply buy your way out of the problem. But here's the twist that I honestly think is the most underappreciated part of this whole story, so let me set it up very carefully for everyone.
Please do, because every single time I think I finally understand the full implications of this case, someone points out yet another wrinkle that complicates the nice, tidy narrative I had just finished constructing in my own head moments earlier.
Because Anthropic chose to settle rather than to appeal, Judge Alsup's fair use ruling never actually went up to the Ninth Circuit or to the Supreme Court. which means, remarkably, that it is not binding precedent on any other court in the country.
So let me make sure I've got this straight. The single most important AI copyright decision in the entire country is technically just one district judge's opinion. And another judge down the hall could conceivably rule the complete opposite way tomorrow morning.
That is exactly the strange situation we find ourselves in. It's persuasive, it's deeply influential, and everyone in the field will cite it endlessly, but it binds absolutely no one. The law here remains genuinely unsettled despite this enormous and extremely public price tag.
That feels almost destabilizing for the industry because you would naturally think that a $1.5 billion settlement would finally bring some clarity. And instead, it brings a giant number attached to a foundation that is still legally ambiguous underneath.
And the companies understand this perfectly well, which is precisely why the very next chapter of this saga is already actively being written. On July 10th of this year, a brand new class action landed in court. And this time, the target is Google.
Tell me about that one, because if the Anthropic case is going to serve as the template for everything that follows, then watching exactly who is suing Google and over what should tell us an enormous amount about where all of this is heading.
The plaintiffs in this new suit are genuine heavy hitters. Hachette Book Group, Cengage Learning, Elsevier, and the well-known author Scott Turow all filed suit over allegations that Google used pirated material to train up its Gemini family of models.
Those are publishing giants, not individual authors this time around. And that shift in exactly who is bringing the suit feels enormously significant to me in terms of the sheer resources and the institutional resolve sitting behind the whole effort.
It absolutely is significant. When academic and educational publishers like Elsevier and Cengage decide to get directly involved, you are suddenly talking about organizations with very deep legal budgets and an extremely direct financial stake in licensing out their enormous catalogs.
Which brings us straight to what I think is the real story sitting underneath the story, which is that all of this litigation is ultimately a fight about the price of data and not merely a fight about the ethics of using it.
That is the exact frame I keep returning to as well. For years, the industry simply treated the open web and even pirated books as free raw material. And this settlement is really the precise moment that comfortable old assumption officially died once and for all.
So if data is no longer free, then there necessarily has to be some kind of market forming to price it properly. And I happen to know that you have been closely tracking the licensing deals that are quietly springing up right alongside all these lawsuits.
I have been, and the numbers are honestly eye-opening. OpenAI alone has signed something like 24 separate publisher and data deals. And the single largest reported one is roughly $250 million spread over 5 years with News Corp.
That is a genuinely staggering figure for what is essentially just permission to read. And it tells me the labs have already privately concluded that licensing is both cheaper and far safer than litigating every single case all the way to the bitter end.
And it is by no means only News Corp involved here. Reddit disclosed more than $200 million in aggregate data licensing value in its filings. And Amazon signed a deal with the New York Times reportedly worth $20 to $25 million every year.
The New York Times example is especially fascinating to me because they are simultaneously suing both OpenAI and Microsoft while at the very same time licensing their content over to Amazon, which feels almost contradictory until you actually stop and think it through for a second.
It is not contradictory in the slightest once you see the underlying logic clearly. You litigate against the company that took your work without ever asking, and you happily license to the company that comes to the table and offers you real money up front.
So the lawsuit and the license are really just two sides of the very same negotiating strategy, a coordinated way of firmly establishing that your catalog carries real value and then forcing everyone else in the ecosystem to formally acknowledge that value too.
That is it exactly. And it neatly explains why we are now seeing this sharply split market emerge, where the big brand name publishers get paid quite handsomely while the long tail of smaller independent creators still struggles to land any deal at all.
That particular inequality worries me a little, honestly, because it strongly suggests that the ultimate winners of this new data economy might turn out to be the very same large institutions that were already powerful, quietly leaving individual creators behind all over again.
It is a very real concern, and the Anthropic settlement is actually the one hopeful counterexample that gives me a bit of optimism. Because it did put real money directly into the hands of individual authors rather than flowing only to the big publishing houses.
That is a genuinely fair point, and $3,000 per book across nearly 500,000 separate works really does add up to something quite meaningful for a great many working writers out there who honestly needed that money more than anyone.
It truly does, though I would gently caution that a one-time settlement payment is a very different animal from an ongoing licensing royalty. And what most authors really want in the end is a durable seat at the table, not merely a single check.
That distinction between a one-time settlement and an ongoing royalty stream is such an important one to draw because one is purely backward-looking compensation, while the other is a genuine business relationship that could conceivably last for many years into the future.
And that is exactly where I believe the whole industry is slowly heading, toward what you might call a permission layer, where using somebody's work for training carries a negotiated price, the very same way sampling a song or licensing a photograph always has.
Let me play devil's advocate for just a moment here, because there is a real and serious argument on the other side which says that pricing all of this data could actually entrench the biggest labs and quietly lock out the smaller open source players.
That is a completely legitimate worry, and I genuinely take it seriously. If high-quality training data ends up costing hundreds of millions of dollars, then only the very richest companies can possibly afford it, and the open ecosystem gets steadily squeezed out.
So we could plausibly end up in a strange world where copyright compliance, which honestly sounds virtuous and fair on its surface, actually becomes a competitive moat that only the wealthiest AI companies can afford to cross, which strikes me as a genuine paradox.
It is a real paradox, and I don't think anyone in this space has a clean answer to it just yet. The optimists are hoping for collective licensing pools, something a bit like what the music industry eventually built, so that smaller players can still pay reasonable rates.
That music industry comparison keeps surfacing again and again, and it genuinely makes a lot of sense because they spent literally decades fighting piracy before finally landing on a licensing framework that, imperfect as it clearly is, at least lets the market actually function.
And that is really the hopeful reading of exactly where we are standing right now. This settlement, as painful as it obviously is for Anthropic, might just be the equivalent of that early turning point when the industry finally accepted that the free ride was truly over.
So if you happen to be an author or publisher listening to this conversation right now, what is the single practical takeaway that you would most want them to walk away with after everything the two of us have laid out here today?
I would say this plainly. Your work has demonstrable value. The courts have now put a real dollar figure on that value, and you should be watching the Google case extremely closely because it is very likely going to shape the entire next round of this ongoing fight.
And if you happen to be building with AI instead, then the lesson is every bit as clear, which is that where your training data actually comes from now matters just as much as what your finished model is ultimately able to do with it.
That is the perfect way to summarize it, Rick. Provenance is no longer some minor footnote buried in a compliance document. It is a core part of the product itself. And the companies that truly internalize that reality early are going to be the ones left standing.
This has been a genuinely fascinating look at how the economics of AI training data are being completely rewritten in real time right in front of us. That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.